Need a search engine optimization SEO services? Then get in touch with our professional and friendly team to learn more about our range of custom and tailored services designed to suit your exact needs. Every one of our professionals have acquired years of experience, which ensures you get the very best. Our experienced staff is waiting to hear from you and to answer any specific questions that you may have on how we can meet your needs. Just ask for a consultation and let us prove our commitment to you as we promise to maintain the highest level of quality and commitment. Your satisfaction is our prime concern. So please, don't hesitate to get in contact with us and let us show you all the great options we have.
Welcome back to episode 4 of The Give and Take. I am your host, Zane Wolfang, here with my co-host.
This is Brother Muggs.
Brother Muggs. And we also have a guest with us today, our friend Antonia Lara Sanchez, who is a teacher at Roger Williams Middle School in the lower south side of Providence. Antonia, welcome.
Hey, how's it going?
Hopefully everybody can hear Antonia. We have her on the phone with us here in the studio. And yeah, it's week 4 of The Give and Take. Myself and Muggs have been at it for 4 weeks now. Tomorrow is the 3rd of July. Traditionally, in my childhood, a big party and celebration day.
I'm sure for a lot of people, it's like has that tradition, you know what I mean? Every year someone does something, people do something.
Right. I'm an East Bay guy, so Bristol Warren, oldest, parade in the country. So definitely a strange 4th of July this year. Of course, a lot of people are concerned about the COVID pandemic and about people gathering. That's in the very forefront of some people's minds and sort of seems to have faded in the background of other people's minds. And then also, of course, Bristol has its own history of slave trade and slave holding. And I like the national reckoning with questions of race and racial justice and racism are not, I think, going to take a pause for the traditionally very star-spangled patriotic
in fact
weekend.
I think if anything, it'll embolden the movements that are in play right now to speak louder on the day that the Star-Spangled Banner is celebrated the most. You know what I mean? And it's a perfect day for people to bring up these issues and talk about the slave history of there. I heard that RISD's old slave block that people are demanding that
Market Square is a petition. Yeah, I saw that online today. Antonia, you saw that?
I did see that.
Yep, I saw that shared today. And I hopefully if our second guest comes through, Brooklyn Toussaint, who is here with us actually in our very first episode, one of the co-founders of a sort of activist group in Providence called ProbX. I think she will speak on some continued protest activity and some continued social justice activity through the 4th of July weekend. But I do want to take a little pivot away from the 4th of July because we have a special opportunity today with Antonia joining us as a teacher in Providence's public school system. So I think that we do want to get into a little bit of just Antonia's experience teaching in Providence, and then maybe we can talk about some current events and issues that are related to the education system in the U.S. But Antonia, do you just want to introduce yourself to the audience and tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So my name is Antonia. I've been living in Providence for 3 years now. I moved from directly to Providence, and since then I've been working inside.
Sorry, Antonia, just hold on. Just hold on 1 second. Is that going to be a continued? Is that going to keep going for quite some time? Okay. Just bear with us. We have some repairs going on in the Give and Take studio. This thing is going to be state of the art when we're done. Let me tell you. Or at least there might be air conditioning. Because let me tell you right now, it is. It's not cold in here, that's for sure. Stay hydrated, you know. All right, Antonia, let's take advantage of the lull.
Sure. So, like I was saying, I moved to Providence 3 years ago from Villa del Mar, Chile. That is where I was born.
Beautiful.
And
Beautiful place.
yeah, I kind of got into Providence. Google actually took me to Providence. I studied, I don't know if I should talk or not with them.
It's cool. The problem with my parents' house is that it was completely empty, so we didn't want to do the show there. Go ahead.
Okay. So I studied industrial design here in Chile, and then I graduated. I decided to move to the U.S. I had lived there before with my parents from like the ages of 3 to 13. So I kind of just looked for a city where I could work as a designer or that had like a big creative community, and that's kind of what brought me to Providence. So I worked at City Arts, which is a nonprofit located on the south side of Providence.
I've heard of City Arts. Cool.
Yeah, honestly, they're amazing.
Is that I don't really know the man personally, but is Len Cabral, the poet, associated with them?
At least when I was there, I didn't hear that
Okay,
name.
I don't want to derail you anyway,
Yeah.
sorry.
But that's kind of how I got into Roger Williams Middle School, because I was a AmeriCorps member there, and I was placed at Roger Williams to help with props and sets for the Lion King show production that they had. And then they decided to hire me as the media arts teacher. So I've been working as the media arts teacher this is going to be my 3rd year now.
Well, so that was at the conclusion of your AmeriCorps service term. They offered you a full-time position as the media arts teacher?
Correct. Yeah, I was only at AmeriCorps through City Arts for probably I want to say 3 or 4 months. And then the cultural coordinator at the time of the school was like, hey, there's this opening. I think you'd be a really good fit. And you should talk to the principal to see what the process is.
Okay, that's great. And so do you feel, are you a member of a public school teachers union?
I am a member of the public schools teachers union, yes.
Is that compulsory for teachers? Like if you get hired as a public school teacher, you become a member of the union?
You have the option. At the beginning of the year, there's a school rep from the PTU. And then she kind of gives you a paper of would you be interested in joining the PTU? And I just felt like it would be the best option.
Right. Are public school teachers who elect not to join the union still protected by the union's labor negotiations?
Not that I know of. I'm definitely not the best person to ask that question. But
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure if you don't join the union, then you won't be protected by the union.
Okay, I was just wondering, I have a part-time job as a cleaner and I don't work full-time, so it doesn't matter. But you are required, you become a union member when you get this job.
Okay.
It's not an option. So I was wondering about that. Anyway, so sort of what was leading me there was I wanted to ask you, after 3 years now as a teacher and a teacher in the creative arts at that in the public school system, do you feel that and maybe these are 2 separate questions, but I'm going to ask them as one. Maybe you can just address them separately or as you see fit. Do you feel that you and your public school students are adequately supported in terms of state funding? Do you feel you have not just dollar amounts, but do you feel you and your students have the resources that you require or that your students require to be educated?
So it's interesting that you asked that question, because today I was actually writing a letter that could be sent out, honestly, to any stakeholder within the Providence school system, asking for financial support, because so the class that I teach is called a career and technical education media arts class. So we're supposed to have a budget. I know that PCTA has over $1,000 a year in their budget, and I guess that since I'm a middle school teacher, I get less, which doesn't really make any sense because it's the same program, and I only get $500, which that doesn't really help
Is PCTA not just for high school? It goes all the way.
PCTA is from freshman to senior, so it's just a high school.
Okay.
Yeah. So to answer your question, no, I don't feel like we are supported enough, and I feel like at least the experience that I've had is just like there's no funding for the arts, specifically for a career and technical education program where we require more funding for computers, for cameras. Like I teach, so actually the classroom has like 18 computers, of which only 7 actually run correctly. And it's hard because I understand my students' frustration where I'm asking them to do one thing and then the computer either turns off by itself or it like freezes or the internet isn't working because of like
are these like old desktop computers?
These are old iMacs.
Okay.
Yeah.
But like console, desktop. Yeah. So
Mm-hmm.
now when you guys kind of switched over to distance learning, how did the public school system handle, I mean, I'm sure your class was heavily affected by not sort of being in person and not having those resources in the school. I'm sure some of your kids don't have iMacs at home, or in the programs on them to do their things. But in terms of resources, like I'm assuming for distance learning, every child would need access to a computer or at least a smartphone. Can they go to class by smartphone? Can they use their parents' phone?
They can, but I would definitely say it's a lot harder. I mean, even if you would try to type something up on Word and at the same time be on a Zoom call and then check your other like Google Classroom classes, which are 7. So it's definitely overwhelming. And I can even imagine that just like being for a student, how stressful that can be. And on top of that, just like not really understanding what's going on because there's a language barrier, for example.
Would you say a lot of your students are bilingual, or would you say, and maybe this is a separate question, not to like parse the nuance too closely, but like, would you say that a lot of your students primarily speak a non-English language in their home? Like you have students who their main exposure to English is at school, but in the home they would be speaking a native language or a separate language from English?
Yes. So a little bit about our school's demographic. I think it's like 70% of the student population is Hispanic. And I think then there's like a 10% of Black students, and then the remaining percentage is between white, Asian, and like others,
Yeah, Providence is quite diverse. I know because of the International Institute and some other nonprofits, actually, there's some refugees that have been resettled in Providence and in Woonsocket over the years and have built large communities. So there is quite a diversity. But yeah, so your school, which is like right Thurber's area, lower South Side.
Thurber's and Prairie Ave. Okay,
is a heavy demographic of people who are students who are primarily speaking Spanish in the home. Okay. And we talked a little bit about this. I believe this is correct. You are a native Spanish speaker in addition to being an English speaker?
Yes. So I was born in the capital of Chile, and when I was 2, my family moved to Mobile, Alabama. We lived there for like 11 years, 12 years. Then we moved back to Chile. And then that's where I did my middle school, high school, undergraduates. And then after that, I moved to Providence.
Go ahead,
I was going to say, can we shift gears a little bit from the education aspect and like take advantage of having someone who is in another country right now? I'd like to know, one, what the view from Chile is on the movement here in the United States. Like, what has the coverage been of the George Floyd murder and the movement as a whole?
Mm-hmm. There's definitely been coverage on the news. I wouldn't say there's much of it because I feel like there's sort of like this, as if it were like an isolated event. But if we compare what happened dropped the bus fare for like, I think it was like 20 cents or something like that. And then things were being burned down and it was just complete chaos, but people are like fed up. Water here is privatized, education is privatized, public transportation is privatized. So I feel like a lot of what's happening in the U.S. is very similar to what happened a couple of months ago here. And there's also like a lot of abuse of power. The first thing that they did was to have curfews, have all the cops in the streets. There's like tanks, which I've never seen. I mean, my parents would send me videos of tanks going down the hill. I live like in a hilly area. So, and that's something that's not new to my parents either. Like they lived during the dictatorship that happened during the 70s.
Yeah. I read about a young man in Chile who last summer had his eye shot out by police. Jesus Velez, I believe his name was. I could be wrong.
Yeah, just the amount of misuse, I would say, of power that happened over just a couple of months. That was like at the end of last year was insane. They were missing people. There were tons of people that lost their vision. Women that were being taken into custody and that were being later, they were sharing their stories that they had been raped or they had been forced to take off all their clothes. So a lot of that is also what happened, in the 70s in this country. People were lost. The national stadium, like the soccer national stadium, was a place of torture, and that's known. So now they were saying that one of the metro stations that got blown up was also being used as a torture center in October. So
Horrible.
This past October?
This past October, yeah. There's also, there's some people that say that the metro station blew up because cops put it on fire. Other people were saying that it was like the extreme left, which would be kind of like the Democratic Party. So, there's both sides to the story, and a lot of it is just like misinformation, I feel. Or it depends on how you want to look at things as well.
Understandable. We've been dealing with a lot of that with the mix of COVID and the recent uprisings. I have one more question, and I'm really interested to know what do you see out of like the art world in Chile from these movements, whether it be raises in privatized tolls or racial injustice or abuse of power? Like, what do you see the art world like from your view, like in Chile now? Like, what is the art world? How are they responding to all of this?
The art world is responding as in favor of this uprise. Absolutely. And I feel like if there were some like an artist to not support it, then they would probably get like shut down. Yeah. Or there's something that's called like Funa, so they'll just like share your picture on Instagram or Facebook or different platforms and say like, oh, fascist, or like, fuck him, or sorry.
No, it's all right. No, this is Coalition Radio. You can say what you got to.
You can swear. Yeah. Swears are okay.
So yeah, you just get shut down. Like people don't want to hear that.
Good.
So I think that that's something that's like the arts in general kind of just always kind of share the stories of voices that haven't been heard, especially like oppressed by governments.
Absolutely.
I mean, that's at least how I see it.
Absolutely. Yeah. No. Here in Providence, there's been a big push through the art community. Just as being a creative city here, we've been pushing through with boards on the front of buildings. There's been full-on walls set up in random alleys that people have done.
And I would say like even arts institutions, not that I'm super linked into, but like I'm sure you're familiar with AS220. Yep. I know they've had medical stations set up during protests. They've, they've had their space sort of opened up, and I think that they had like an internal discussion, like many institutions did, about like addressing systemic racism, or maybe like unconsciously or lazily racist behaviors. Like they did like the internal recommitment, but they've also, like, the arts community has been involved by making art and facilitating sort of creative work that's commentary on the social justice movement. But they've also been involved, like, donating water and like being a part and being out protesting. I think that in a lot of countries, the creative community is generally out there in force or in a higher percentage than other communities regarding social justice issues.
And that's something that I wish that would be replicated here. You see that mainly in the capital.
When you say here, you mean Chile?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Sorry. So I'm thinking that there's like this big art museum in the capital, and that's kind of where a lot of the art has been displayed for the protest. But it's just the capital. Like, there's nothing really going on here on the coast, which is just like an hour away from the capital. And I don't know if that's because artists aren't being organized in that sense, or I really don't know.
It does seem like, creatives are drawn to certain cities, and then it's almost like there are other creatives that don't want to go to those places. Like, you want to go to Providence instead of New York because everybody goes to New York. But there needs to be some critical mass of creatives of like-minded purpose, I think, in order for that collaboration and for that organization to happen. Like, I felt that as someone who's struggled to write more in my life, like, there's something to be said for being surrounded by other writers.
I have the rare privilege of having been to Viña del Mar and Valparaiso, and I loved that city. And the one thing that always stood out to me was the the city's crushed. It's covered in street art. There are so many artists out there. There's so many young people out there, like, really doing their thing, really putting in work. And so that's why I was kind of gearing towards that, because I figured there would be a big like movement or push or something like that we've seen in other cities worldwide.
I do want to circle us back to Providence a little bit. And I know, like, we are trying to like take advantage of Antonia's dual expertise. Having like the Chilean roots, and there having been, these crazy protests that were sparked by this increase in metro fare in Santiago, right, to take public transportation. It wasn't really about the train, right? That was like the straw that broke the camel's back. It was this privatization thing. But Antonia, of course, has also, been in the public school system for 3 years. So I do want to pivot back to Providence. I know you're not here with us right now, but in many ways, you've obviously been involved in the Providence community and with your students for over 3 years now. Are there police officers in Roger Williams Middle School, or is there a student resource officer, at least one?
There's none. But what
That's
I
good.
can say is that when the shooting outside of PCTA happened last year, I had a conversation with my 8th grade students about how they felt and how they would want or envision the school to be in terms of safety. And a lot of them said that they actually wanted a police officer outside for dismissals.
They wanted the police officer there.
Yes, they did. But that's also just based off of a conversation with 20 students, so that doesn't mean that's representative.
It's also different than the narrative that's being spoken now about resource officers being in the schools, patrolling the hallways.
Right, that's why I wanted to ask.
Yeah,
I didn't go to school in Providence. You went to school in Providence.
Yeah, I went to school.
Was there a cop in your school?
Yes.
In middle school?
No.
Right. Okay. So that's, because I'm being supportive. I'm at the rallies. We're saying these SROs have got to go. I'm hearing some people say there's a cop in every middle school.
That they're outside for dismissal. I think that's a little different than like a student resource officer that's in the school for them to like go and speak.
Right. But I believe Antonia is saying there's not a police officer inside.
No, but the thing is that also we have to understand that even though that there's not that resource officer, there's still admin, and they're also like patrolling, if you want to use that word, like the hallways to make sure that everybody's in class, or they're the first ones to be called when there's a teacher having a problem and they need to kick a student out. So really we have to think about what the difference of teachers or admin acting in that way versus having a parole officer.
So you think the disciplinary structure at the public school that you're at is still a bit too harsh or police-like? It's too focused on discipline?
I wouldn't necessarily think that, only because we do incorporate restorative practice into the building. So for example, if there's two students having an issue, they'll both be called, and it's just having a conversation about what happened and understanding both sides of the story, and kind of just like de-escalating through conversation. Right. So there's really not that many students that are getting expelled or suspended, and that's because we try to have these restorative practices.
So that's good. So it sounds, that's like, I'm trying to get a little more insight into the school system. And I know people who have been out protesting that I've spoken to have spoken very poorly about the Rhode Island Training School, which I also know very little about. But those same people have spoken more highly of Rhode Island Ocean Tides, which is an organization I know a little bit about. They have a link with LaSalle Academy quietly.
I would speak higher of like Youth Build or something like that.
I'm not familiar.
Okay, Youth Build is just a program for high school level students. I know Antonio works with middle schoolers, and that's like the focus. But Youth Build works with like high school students to get them into some form of trade that they're interested in. I wish that there was more of a push to get them more enthusiastic about academics, but if that's not the direction that a child wants to go, then giving them a better opportunity to be the best tradesman is also awesome.
And there are, that's interesting. Like, I know we're on the Coalition Network. I don't know. There's usually this guy, Pat Ford, with us. He's the mild-mannered maverick at the head of Coalition Radio. And he's also the president of the Rhode Island Libertarian Party. But there is some overlap on some, like, I would say, like, vocational programming in schools is something there's probably overlap with somebody like myself and Muggs, and probably yourself, who tend to skew liberal in that sort of like very basic binary, versus some of our Libertarian Coalition listeners, or even like someone like my parents who are, hold more moderate sort of political and social views than I do. But like, that's an obvious focal point for even friends I have who I found out voted for Trump, like overhauling the education system to include more creative programming, including vocational programming, is something I think there's a lot of consensus on, right? Like there's things like school vouchers. There was a recent Supreme Court case, about like whether you can use a school voucher for a religious private school versus a charter school, and you can, according to the Supreme Court, based on this case in Montana, because they're saying that you're giving, well, I didn't read the case, so I don't want to
I understand.
Guess about the legal theory, but they're saying if you're giving money to the people to go to different schools, you can't you can't exclude. Well, you can't exclude religious people. You can't say, because your preference is Christian, you can't go there.
Betsy DeVos made
push
for private schools.
But so vouchers, right there. There's these issues of religion. That's like a complex issue that ends up getting split on that liberal conservative binary. But something like providing more vocational programming is, I think that something that people could build upon very easily, especially in a small state like Rhode Island. Like, I'm particularly unimpressed by Rhode Island politicians at large, and like it seems I've been away, right? Like you leave Rhode Island, you have roots somewhere else. My roots are here, but I've traveled elsewhere. And when I come back, some people really hate Gina Raimondo, hate her, but it's almost like I think whoever the governor was, they would hate them, right? Like what depresses me about Rhode Island politics is like just like a level of like acceptable mediocrity, right? Like just not trying actually that hard. We have like almost like a square number population of 1 million in the most manageable land area in the United States. And like, we are the smallest state. We have, I don't know how many school districts, right? Like, we could just be a model of innovation and even experimentation with regards to democracy, with regards to public school programming, little pilot programs. Like Rhode Island is being praised now for how it's handling the COVID response. Like, I don't want to take credit away from a government that seems to be doing a good job, but like
when you're dealing with a state as small as Rhode Island,
It should be easier.
There's like familiarity.
It should
that
be
goes
easier to handle COVID in Rhode Island than in California. Like, it's not surprising to me that Rhode Island is doing better than Texas.
It's more manageable because
yeah.
the borders are
If Rhode
close.
Island was doing worse than Texas, Rhode Island would super suck, right? Because like you should be able to handle that shit. For the same reason, right? Like when Los Angeles and Minneapolis are like, we're gonna defund our entire police department. And Providence is like, well, I don't know if we can do that. I'm like, there's 85,000 people in the city. We're like a neighborhood on the outskirts of Los Angeles.
To touch on what you said with the accepted mediocrity of our politicians here, I think that's just like a Rhode Island thing. You know what I mean? It's like, well, I went to high school with him, so he's a decent guy. You know what I mean? And because we're so small, that familiarity that we talked about last week kind of goes into people's decision making. Someone could be a horrible person. They could be like, outed as like not a good person, not a good leader. And people would still be like, oh, well, they grew up in the town I grew up in, so.
And people don't run, people don't run as Republicans here. People don't run as, very rarely do they run as independents or moderate party or whatever else is, they often don't run in Democratic primaries, which would be the general in many a Rhode Island race. Like, when I volunteered for Laura Pisatoro to run against Mike McCaffrey, who's still in the House, he had been unopposed in a primary for 12 years. 12 years, I mean, the neighborhood's fine. It's not amazing. I don't think that Mike McCaffrey isn't like God's gift to politicians, just like literally no one's running against him. No one cares enough to get involved at that level.
Jackson, the city councilman for Ward, the East Side, was there for years, you know what I mean? But then got arrested for embezzlement.
So we're going to try and get our second guest on in about 2 minutes and sort of pivot. But I do want to finish, obviously, with a thank you to Antonia. But I do want to ask one more question. Okay. If let's say the state police department were seriously defunded in any way, right? Like if any serious attempt were made to divert funding from the Rhode Island State Police to public school districts in Rhode Island, what would you perceive? And I want you to try and be altruistic here. I know, like, obviously every teacher wants funding for their for the area that they hold dear. What would you perceive, though, overall as the most pressing need of, let's say, the Providence Public School District that could benefit from some of this funding diverted from an inflated police budget?
I would have to say, and this is obviously based on my experience, is just having money for supplies. I think that there's a lot of teachers, and I was even reading this week that there was a study that was done that says that on average, a teacher spends around $500 to almost $1,000 a year.
Out of their pocket.
Out of pocket. Yep, out of pocket to fund supplies for the classroom. So just taking a look at that, but also I feel like if we were to have a program say, okay, each teacher has X amount of money, then teachers also need to be organized and just plan out very well what they're going to need, when they're going to need, because I've even been in the place where it's just like, oh, this week I need this, so I need to run to the store, so just making sure that we're planning for the entire year, not just a couple of months or the semester, and that way we could use that funding appropriately.
All right, so now, like, that's like a very tangible thing, right? Out of the program less so, but like the supplies. But what about like from an intangible? Like before we were talking about a bit of a language barrier and distance learning, and maybe, sorry, I'm keeping you on a little bit longer because our second guest hasn't come on yet, and I'm like happy to keep talking to you. So I've been listening to a few things like on NPR and what have you about concerns regarding education funding and returning to school with the risk of COVID still in place.
Well, that's a different story because, first of all, I mean, what pops into my head, it's like, how are buses going to run? How are students going to eat? The school food is disgusting. Nobody likes it. If you look at it, it's just like, who would want to eat that food? Then
have you eaten it? Have you eaten the food?
honestly, I think that the only thing that's like decent are the nachos. I'm not gonna lie, but everything else is just like disgusting. So, and kids know that they don't like it. Nobody enjoys the food. Most of it goes into the trash can. So there's tons of milk cartons that are going to be thrown away. Tons of apples, fruit that only has a bite. So that's something too. Just having like nutritious food for children. It's like the basics, you know. And then maybe for teachers to be more training on anti-racism, just like very basic things that I feel like I personally haven't experienced as a teacher. We have a very basic training about LGBTQ plus community, but that was like an hour or two at the beginning of the year, and then there's no accountability for teachers. So what if there were actually like a committee that goes around every now and then into every classroom in the district that sees like, okay, what are students' feedback? How do they feel in their classrooms? How is their relationship with their teachers? And then go from there. Because a lot of times there's teachers that have been accused of saying racist comments, but the problem is that there's so many vacancies, like nobody really wants to work in public schools. And I don't know if that's also even harder, one, because of COVID, but also because of the report that came out, the Johns Hopkins report. Like Providence was one of the worst schools in the nation, the worst district. So
in terms of like, in terms of outcomes, or in terms of like as a work environment for teachers?
In terms of students' reading levels,
okay, so
of math levels, in terms of like how the buildings are, like the infrastructure of buildings. So yeah,
right.
there's
I heard
a lot
thing.
going on.
I have two. You made me think of two things. One I heard on NPR today, and it was a woman who's a school teacher in Brooklyn talking about going back to. They've been told they're going back into the building for the fall, and she said when she left in the summer, the sinks, the majority of the sinks in the school she worked in were broken, had no running water, and the soap dispensers were empty. And like, so she was speaking specifically to like a COVID risk, like, oh no, we can't wash our hands, but just on like a basic level of like caring for human beings, right? Like their elementary and middle schools and major.
Sure their police department has a tank.
Right? Has what kind of vehicle has, you know, although the whole idea about like defunding the police vis-a-vis like expensive equipment is, I think, a bit of a red herring, but I don't want to like dive down that black hole, you know, and talk about like police unions and the reality of like salary comprising the vast majority of any institution's budget. So I guess like when you, okay, so you're a teacher, right? When you cut, let's say 15% of a public school district's budget, what happens? How do you achieve those budget cuts? By buying less paper? No, you fire teachers. Yeah, you.
They're the first ones to go.
Central Falls this year, arts teachers fired, PE teachers fired, nurses. School psychologists would be fired if we had those in the United States, but that's not really like a, you know, most. I think a lot of schools don't have. We had guidance counselors, I guess, at my high school. I never went to the guidance counselor.
That, you know, there's definitely a big topic about defunding the police. And by the time that something like that happens, I mean, that would be amazing. Who wouldn't want that? But we really need to do some soul searching and say, like, what am I actually, if I'm actually interested in the education of students in Providence or of students in other cities, what am I doing as a person to make it a better and more enjoyable place for students? So, because it's really easy to complain about everything, you know, and I'm not saying that there's something wrong with that, but like me as Antonia, okay, maybe I'm going to go volunteer or check out and see if I can teach in an after school program, or reach out to a local teacher and say like, hey, I'd really like to help you, you know, get supplies for your classrooms before the year starts. Do you need cleaning supplies? Like, what is it that we need? Because there's not really much support from the government.
Nice. Well, thank you, Antonia, for real. This was a great discussion. I think we got to a lot of key points here. And yeah, we appreciate you coming on, especially from such a distance and with a lot of our technical difficulties and studio updates that are going on through all this. So we appreciate you, for real.
Thank you for having me.
Antonia, thank you very much for your insights. Very nice to meet you. And maybe we can have you on the show again at some point. That'd be great.
I'd love that.
All right. Thank you very much. Have a good night. It seems our second guest is also having some technical difficulties.
I think that was it was good to get a perspective from another place on what the movement looks like. Whether it be directly related to George Floyd and the murders that have been seen on television, or just an abuse of power from a government, and seeing the people's reaction to it. You know what I mean?
Right. I felt like, there's always so many things that you want to talk about, right? You can't ask every question you want to. But the protests in Chile were quite large and quite sustained. And I have to wonder, how COVID affected those protests. I think that they really died down in a lot of places, because in the past year, right? And what I'm really getting to here is how much would Chileans have time and emotional bandwidth to care about a racial struggle in the United States when they're in the midst of their own huge sort of society shaking protests about capitalism and about inequality. And I think there is, racism in Chile. I am very good friends with a Chilean couple that I met in Bethlehem, and they the wife and the couple had taken a sort of job through her university to teach Spanish in Bethlehem for a set point in time. Yeah. And so they were so sick of Chilean society, and they lived in Santiago, and the expense and the inequality and just the way things were, how broken they felt their society was. They sold everything. Yeah. They went to Bethlehem. They finished out her term of service there as a Spanish teacher. They had gotten Italian or EU citizenship through the husband's Italian heritage, and they moved to the Netherlands. Nice. They were when they went back to visit for the first time recently, but they have no intention of going back to Chile. They feel that it's very unequal and is.
I guess I wasn't thinking in terms of people's own struggle. They don't have time for ours. I guess where it came from, it stemmed from seeing all the protests on television from around the world. There were protests in China for George Floyd. There were protests in Jamaica. There were protests in parts of Africa, parts of Europe. Actually, lots of parts of Europe took place.
There were absolutely massive protests in Iraq for the vast majority of my time there. Yeah. Not where I lived, not in the Kurdistan region, but in Baghdad and in Basra in the south, and in a few cities, just absolutely massive and ongoing demonstrations. People camping in the street for weeks at a time.
So I guess that's where that question stemmed from. I needed to see what the scene was like down in Chile versus all these other places I've seen.
Right. Unfortunately, Brooklyn Toussaint, the ProbX founder, is having some difficulties with our link. Or I don't want to put the blame on her. The link is not working for her. We did want to talk about ProbX's sort of ongoing engagement in the Black Lives Matter and anti-racist movement in Rhode Island. I know they're involved with Providence Student Union and Gen Z, We Want to Live. Muggs, I don't know if you heard, but the two young women, Isabella and Jay Shell, who founded that Gen Z, We Want to Live organization, the Central High School students, they were on Bill Bartholomew's podcast in the past few days. Not hear that, actually, he did a good almost hour with them. Both raised a lot of good points. Bill gave them a lot of space, a good platform.
I gotta give that a listen to.
Yeah, it was. It was very good. In any case, I know that that Brooklyn is, and ProbX have been coordinating with them over some events over the past few weeks.
They were very vocal at the voting table that we had set up during the Juneteenth celebration. Helped us get some people walking.
They sparked some late energy there. Yeah, they took a more active approach to recruiting potential voters than we did, I guess. I've thought about that. I set up the table, I sit and I wait. It's in very big letters on the whiteboard, voter registration help. Yeah. I don't go corral people. I want it to be a service.
I want people have to understand that, your vote. There are people who don't get that. There isn't a table at every capital in the world. You know what I mean? And
Right. And I
up to
printed
it
this
as well.
stuff off the Secretary of State's website. Like one could do it, but it's like I also have interfaced with the system more. You know what I mean? Like it was easy for me. I was like, I know that I can help people by having this. Like I carry around a pen. This sounds silly. I almost always have a pen. I almost always have a pen.
80.
I almost always have a pen.
You do.
Yes.
But
You got to bring people the pens and the paper.
It's one of those horse to water situations. You know what I mean? How close can you bring someone to register?
Right. And so that's my strategy has been just to be water near a lot of horses.
Yeah, no, you are the water balloon.
We just find a lot of horses and set up a little water.
Yeah,
and we're like, hey,
sure.
we didn't.
I think that I was very much appreciated that day getting people sort of corralled to the table without doing it. But I think it was we had a really good response from people just walking by and reading it as well.
Right, and those are people. It's really interesting to me to see people are almost like a little nervous. They're like, but also maybe they think they have to pay, or or they're like, what organization are you from? And I'm like, none. I'm drinking a Miller High Life. It's Juneteenth.
The change started. I noticed anyway. The change started when one woman had asked, and I don't want to assume her identity, but this individual had come up and asked, what if I think I'm registered? And of course the answer was, we can look it up really easily, 1, 2, 3. And once people heard that, a line started to form. And it was like, oh, my convenience won't be bothered like that much.
And I do want to shout out Secretary of State Nellie Gorbea, who I do really like and respect. I do think she's good at her job. I think she's sincere. I think she's a good public servant. And she did, under her watch, they've created this voter information access website, which doesn't sound like a big thing, but I mean, they're the they were like, hey, people should just be able to type their name and zip code and see their voter information. There are also private websites that do that. Politiscope app was created by millennials. You can look up a lot of legislation on that. When I was working for Rhode, when I was working for Rhode in Erbil, I would there's even lists on Twitter. I'm not on Twitter, but there are awesome pre-made like C-SPAN, the very boring political channel, unless the House of Commons is on, like the British Parliament. Fantastic.
Oh, yeah.
They just fire witty repartees at each other. Yeah, it's amazing. But C-SPAN on Twitter has pre-made lists in House Democrat leadership, House Republican leadership, foreign policy senators. So you can really, and then there are sites that track legislation.
Politiscope is the only one I'm familiar with, and I use it, one, because it's run by those who are my age, and two, because it's black owned. So it's nice to see, and it's informative.
It's like a news aggregator, and that's usually what they advertise. But actually, if you go, and I will say, all love to Jackson White and Walter Powell. I would love to get at least one, if not both of them, on the show. Jackson and I texted briefly the other day.
I had some correspondence with him not too long ago.
Yeah. I want to get him on the show. I think he'd be a great guest. The app can load a little bit slow at times. Don't want to be a hater, but that's partially because they're trying to do a lot, and they're doing a lot, right? So you can track legislation. You can see what your specific legislators, your districts are doing. You can get notifications or not. I think they're working on some interface to donate to candidates as well, but I don't want to tread outside of my limited expertise. But their editor, Jackson White, it would be great to get him on the show. I was talking to him recently. So, we need to figure out our link situation. Might be time to update the link or figure that out. And I need to be more on my game to catch some people in the Middle East for recorded interviews because they're 7 hours ahead of us. So this time slot is tough for even the hardest partners in our field.
There's a few guests that have another perspective on the movement. And when I say the movement, I just mean any form of anti-racism that's coming about, whether that be posts that are coming out, whether it be news, any part of the movement affecting all demographics of those who are disenfranchised by this corrupt system. There are some views from other cities, other places in the world on how they're approaching it, and I find it very interesting, and I try to reach out to as many people I know in other states.
Right. And on the note of unjust systems, I know it's July 2nd. We're going to wrap up here in a second. It is a hard 4th of July to figure out how to feel. I think that I felt that way for a long time because I lived in the occupied West Bank of Palestine for 2 years, and I lived in Iraq for 8 months. And people will sort of assume that you're a soldier if you say you've lived in Iraq. I'm not. I have no military background or experience. You know that. The listeners may not. I've always been a teacher and like a wannabe writer, an ultimate Frisbee coach out there in these countries. But it's harder to muster up the same sort of blind enthusiasm you had for the red, white, and blue as a kid when the whole, like understanding the festivity before you understand the symbolism of the event is like just an unavoidable aspect of being a human and growing up, but it's also very dangerous, and it's hard to parse like the years and years of joy and like family relations that really have nothing to do with the symbolism of the holiday, right? Like the reason you love 4th of July, I don't love 4th of July because because I want to be a presidential historian. I love 4th of July because we used to go to my mom's parents' house in Bristol, Rhode Island, and walk to the parade.
Yeah.
Right. And it was just like this family thing. So like I'm going to protest stuff tomorrow. Brooklyn can't be here, but there's like a 3:30 to 5 event at the State House, the Rhode Island State House tomorrow, where some issues specific to the incarceration system and the prison system and prison abolition will be discussed. I probably won't be there right at 3:30. I'd like to get there at about 4. And then there will be an open mic protest where speakers are signing up to get up on the pulpit and talk about Black Lives Matter and anti-racism. And I think there will be some sort of march after that.
And this is on what day?
Tomorrow, July 3rd.
This is tomorrow.
Yeah,
July
and
3rd.
it's like it is a test of commitment, of course. I've been invited to some parties. People are, and I'm sure there's some people who are afraid of COVID or horrified to hear all of that, right?
Like address when you first got into this discussion about how to feel on July 4th about this. And quite honestly, I think you can be for the movement and be for America at the same time. America's beautiful because we can protest these things. America's beautiful because we can call people out on their bullshit. That's what I love about this country.
I just watched the West Wing episode where Penn and Teller burn a flag in the White House.
Nice.
Yeah, it's topical. Anyway.
Yeah. I think, with me, my family's origins begin in the South. And, I have family members who belong to someone who was an American and who also celebrated 4th of July. So my ancestors couldn't enjoy it, But am I going to disregard all the sacrifices they made to make this country actually what they thought it could be? They built the foundation for this, and I want to celebrate that. That day, I'm not thinking about presidents. I'm not thinking about the flag. I'm thinking about them. You know what I mean? Like they sowed the seeds to make this country wealthy. We're not going to say great, but the country's definitely wealthy.
Yeah.
And without their sacrifices and I mean, when you don't have a choice, it's really, I don't know if you call it, but
right.
When you don't have a choice, it's what it is. You just don't have a choice. That's what I'm celebrating. And I can,
Well, I've seen you at many of Bristol 4th of July, right?
No,
and
sure.
In the classic way, not like we went there together. Like we were both hammered and crossed paths at some point within the 8-block radius of it.
And to be real, for those of you who are not Rhode Islanders, you might know that the 3rd of July is the 4th really for us. You know what I mean?
For the youngsters.
For the youngsters.
Yeah.
If what's the saying? People will ask, "Hey, what are you doing for the 4th?" Someone will say, "I'm not drinking a 5th on the 3rd, so I can remember the 4th."
That's good. I used to have this saying in college. I'd say, sometimes the pregame becomes the game, and that has become the truth of July 3rd in Rhode Island. But I think that's a very positive outlook. I, for one, I've had to be more ambivalent. I've been abroad as well for some 4th of Julys and some in some countries that have been affected negatively by America. Obviously, I'm going to keep circling back to Palestine. I know that people are finally seeing some stuff on their social media about annexation of the Jordan River Valley. And I understand the frustration of people, of Palestinians and people who have been following this for literally decades, and understand that a lot of that land is already de facto annexed, and like this very systematic and decades long process of disenfranchisement, but that is culminating. This isn't like some new chapter in the saga of the Israel-Palestine conflict and inequity. There's an inequity to that conflict, right? They're not equal sides.
For our listeners, I think people should take this time to not only look inwardly, look at the things that we're doing, but also look at international.
Right. Yeah. I don't want to get like way off on the train, but right. Like annexation is happening now. So at least people are talking about it. But a lot of people are already resigned to that fate. But, I'm going to be with my family on the 4th of July, a small gathering, but I do want to remember that I'm on native land. I do want to remember that Bristol was really founded by some very wealthy slave traders, and it's like sort of unavoidable to think about that history if you also want to celebrate the fact that it's the oldest 4th of July parade in the country. It's like 200 something years old. Yeah. Like, guess what? At the point when it started, most of the people in that parade were super racist. Like, that is, if you want to celebrate how old, like, I love the continuity of the American tradition, like the idea of it. That's what they get you as a, but like, so we want to celebrate. I love the positive message, but like, we also like a lot of the outrage that people are shutting out, like people are righteously indignant on one side and people are instinctively like shameful and like, I'm not going to listen on the other. Like, I would say that a lot of like people continuously bringing up you're on native land, these indigenous people were wiped out. The brutal history of racism in America is it's very stark. It does feel very brutal. It's hard to address emotionally, but it is a reminder really to everyone in society to be more mindful. Yeah. Right. So for me, that I'll be enjoying 4th of July, but it's, it's not going to be like,
Also, there is no parade this year. So I feel like that extra element of we'll just keep Bristol in the conversation here. With Bristol, there's no parade this year. So that same energy that you would have gotten any other year won't be there. Where will it go? Where will that energy go towards that people usually put towards, their drunken walk down to the parade?
I'm assuming fireworks.
Fireworks is, yep.
I'm assuming it's going to be an obnoxious amount of fireworks. I'm actually not assuming because that's already the case in my neighborhood in Warren.
It's been the 4th for the past 4 weeks. So.
That's how it goes. That's how it goes here. But yeah, we need like some outro music so we can tune ourselves out when we keep rambling. Yeah. Maybe Freddie Gibbs is the move. All right, well, we didn't have Pat tonight, but Muggs, it was a solid episode. I'm so glad that Antonia joined us. I'm very sorry to Brooklyn that we couldn't get her on, but I do want to reiterate on behalf of our guests from Provex who couldn't make it, that people who are interested in peacefully protesting, I think there will be masks being handed out. Rhode Island Department of Health can test anyone who attended a protest for free, I believe. I don't know where or how. That was the scuttlebutt. But yeah, 3:30 to 5, some conversations about the ACI and the corrections system specific to Rhode Island over at the State House. And then 5 to 7, an open mic protest, and then a march, all probably in that downtown State House to Kennedy Plaza area. Hopefully Pat Ford will be out there. I'm sure the indefatigable Bill Bartholomew will be out there, and I'll be out there trying to register a few people to vote. So this has been the give and take. Thank you very much.